Now that the pre-release weekend is over with, let's go ahead and talk about some cards in Commander that I think players should be picking up for their collections. And we'll start with the best removal spell coming out of the set with Get Lost. One in a white, you get to blow up one of three different kinds of targets, and it just gives them a little pair of measly map tokens for the trouble. Now, map tokens really aren't that great. They're sorcery speed only, and at best, you might feed into some artifact synergies, but otherwise, they're kind of slow and they're not all that good. And this is a much better card than Fateful Absence ever hoped to be. So this card is probably going to maintain value and may even go up because it's probably going to see home in standard decks as long as the mono red menace doesn't keep preventing a white deck from emerging. Now, blue mages may be interested in Tishana's Tidebinder. This merfolk can flash in, it can counter a triggered or an activated ability of something, and then it locks that thing down. So, like if you have a creature that's tapping to draw cards, or the One Ring, or whatever kind of thing you have going on, one of those things is going to get locked down, and it does nothing until they get rid of Tishana's Tidebinder. So they're wasting their removal trying to get rid of this thing so they can use their toys, and at the same time, they may not have any way of getting rid of it. So it's going to stay locked down until this thing is gone. And your opponents are not going to be incentivized to try to use their removal to get rid of this unless it gets caught up in a mass removal spell. So only the person that got countered is going to want to try to get rid of this thing. Everybody else would be like, great, you stop them from using their thing for us. Go ahead and keep it. Now, I talked about this card extensively during the previous season, but this is Bloodletter of Aclazotz. For 4 mana, you get a 2/4 flying vampire demon that in essence doubles your damage as long as it's your turn. So black just gained a Furnace of Wrath style effect, but it counts for all life loss, not just damage. So with all the drain effects that black has and all of the creature damage and everything else, it all adds up into getting doubled as long as it's on your turn. So this might actually see a lot of play in Commander. I think if you're playing black, you should probably be running this card almost regardless of whatever else your deck is doing, as long as you're trying to actually damage your opponents out of the game. And this is just a really good card, and it will go up in price because I do think it's going to see some standard play as well. Then the next card I think everybody should take a look at, especially if you're in red, of course, is Brass's Tunnel Grinder. Now, I talked about this card extensively as well as the Bloodletter in the previous season, but this thing is a good way to cycle through your hand as a wheel effect. And then once you get to flip over into its land component, you get to do discover tricks off of your deck. Now, the bigger the creature that you're doing, the bigger the discover is going to be off of it. So it's just a fun card, and it's a good way to get free spells off of your deck later in the game. Now, this card doesn't require you to be into a pirate themed deck, but it is a pirate. It's Enterprising Scallywag. 2 mana, it's a 2/2 that generates treasures as long as a permanent went to your graveyard this turn. That's it. As long as you've descended this turn, you get a treasure token at the end of your turn every time. It's just a good card in general, especially in decks that need to have some kind of extra ramping going on. And if you're doing any kind of impulse draws to go ahead and discard cards in your graveyard, as long as one of those things that got discarded is a permanent, it's going to go off. Another favorite of mine from the previous season is the Scytheclaw Raptor. This thing punishes blue mages and anybody else that tries to play control shenanigans, and I love making them eat that damage for the privilege of trying to mess with what I'm doing. So if you're playing red, I highly recommend getting a copy of this, and the best part of all, it's not a rare. Now, this is a card that I recommended in the Merfolk Precon upgrade video. It's Jadelight Spelunker. For X and a green, you get to explore X times you put in there. Now, this is a merfolk, but you don't necessarily need to have a merfolk deck to use this card because you get the +1/+1 counter synergies and a +1/+1 counter deck. So those kind of decks, you're going to probably want to go ahead and use this. Plus, the explore mechanic allows us to dig through our deck if we want to. So maybe you're playing some kind of green X deck that wants things in the graveyard. Well, you can explore, X amount of times and dig down into your deck and be like, okay, there's a permanent, and just start chucking stuff into the graveyard off of it in order to get those in there and pump this thing up at the same time. Another green card that might interest commander players, but it also is interesting the modern community as well, is Spelunking. For 2 and a green, you get an enchantment that allows your lands to come into play untapped. So any kind of the lands that say this enters tapped do not come in untapped or come in tapped anymore off of this thing sitting here on the battlefield. So I actually like this card in a lot of decks because especially if you're not able to afford the more expensive mana bases and you're in a green deck, playing this allows you to use the cheaper mana bases and not have to worry about the drawback of your stuff coming into play tapped all the time. Then we have the first legend I'm recommending players pick up, and that is the Bartolome del Presidio card. It's a free sack engine. There's nothing more to say about it. There are some of the most powerful cards available to us in Commander. No restriction, no mana payments, no you must control X thing, whatever, nothing. There's none of that stuff going on. We're able to sacrifice at will and do all kinds of sacrifice shenanigans with this. So any kind of deck that's an aristocrat style deck, it doesn't have to be a vampire deck and just to be a sacrifice to win the game type deck. This card should be in that deck, so I highly recommend picking it up. And luckily, it's an uncommon. Not so lucky is the fact that the next card is a mythic rare and is already slightly expensive for what it is. It's Shamil, the Inner Sun. Six colorless. Your stuff can't be countered, which is the best part of the card altogether. I love that ability on cards. I love being able to lock my opponents out of being able to counter my stuff. But then you get free spells off the top of your deck every single turn. It's just so fun to get free stuff off your deck. And if you've ever played a Cascade deck, this is going to be a fun addition to anything like that to get an additional cascade style effect in your deck. So anybody who's ever played Blade of the Blood Chief knows the power of Teran's Soul Cleaver. Now, the cool part about this one is one, you don't have to be in a vampire deck like that one. But also, this triggers off of your opponent's creatures and artifacts going to the graveyard as well. So if somebody's treasure happy or blood or food token happy, they're going to get punished by having this thing put counters on whatever it's equipped to over and over and over again. And at the same time, anytime you're sacrificing stuff or you're sacrificing your treasures and whatnot, you're going to go ahead and make the thing bigger and bigger as well. So this is really good for any kind of Voltron style commander where you're trying to knock somebody out via commander damage or just building up a really big threat. And it combines well with any kind of like +1/+1 counter synergy deck as well as a sacrifice deck. Now, this card is getting a lot of talk right now online, and that is Pit of Offerings. It's a land that comes to play tapped. You can exile up to 3 cards out of graveyards, and then it taps for whatever color the things you've exiled are. And people are kind of complaining about whether it's a color pie break or anything like that, which I don't care. At this point, this allows us to get a Bajuka Bog light effect in any color deck. So you don't have to be in black like you do with the Bajuka Bog because of the color locking on it in Commander. But in this case, we get to go ahead and start nuking out our graveyards and tearing down our opponent's stuff that way. The other card that's a land in this whole pile of stuff I'm talking about today that I think you should pick up is Cavern of Souls. Because holy crap, reprints work. It's amazing. This thing actually has dove from about a $55 to $60 card down to like a $25 card right now. However, and there's a big however attached to this, I think that's going to go up pretty quickly because this also introduces this card to the Pioneer format. There's going to be players trying to try this in there to see if they can build some kind of deck where this helps them in that format. So it's more than likely going to go back up. I think it's almost to hit the bottom of the barrel. You might get down to $20 in the next week or so. Keep an eye on it. But if you've been wanting a copy of this card, now is the time to get it before it spikes back up. Now, as far as I understand for this next card, these only show up in the set boosters as like a slot card. So the Illustrious Wander glyph here, it creates these gnome artifact tokens on every upkeep. So it's kind of like a Verdant Force, but it's for an artifact creature. So if you have anything that has like an artifact theme, you want to pick something up like this so you're getting multiple tokens turn after turn. And this is pretty cheap to begin with. And then if you get the Ascend, your artifact creatures get the +2/+2 ability as well, like Tempered Steel. So I kind of like that. It's kind of a good card, and I think it's going to see play. It's actually fairly expensive though because it's a lot rarer than your standard rares and packs because it only shows up in that one slot. So if you see it and the prices come down a little bit on it, I would go ahead and jump on it if you want it. Now the last few cards I want to talk about, these actually come in the pre-con decks. You've seen them in my upgrade videos because I've talked about all the new cards, but these are cards that if you haven't bought the pre-cons, these are singles you may want to pick up for your decks otherwise. Let's start off with the Grim Captain's Locker. Now, the cool thing here, besides the fact that it helps us fill the graveyard if you want to play a reanimator strategy or just cycle through your deck a little bit quicker, is you get the ability to give any creature in your graveyard escape of 3 and a black and remove 4 cards from your graveyard. Now, I've had people like, oh, this thing sucks, it's terrible, blah, blah, blah. It's actually pretty good because 4 mana to escape a creature and then just 4 cards to get it back is actually relatively cheap for a reanimations thing. And in a black deck, say you have Shieldred Whispering one or basically any of the Praetors for the most part, if they got pitched in the graveyard and you're paying 4 mana and 4 cards to get it back, That's a hell of a discount, and I'll take that every day of the week. And speaking of discount ways of getting things back of our graveyard, I also like another legend I'm going to recommend from the vampire deck. It's the Carmen sadistic sky marcher card. This thing allows us to, every time we sacrifice something, so Bartolome would work really well here, as well as any other sacrifice engines, is going to pump her up, and the bigger her power goes, the bigger the thing she can help us resurrect from the graveyard every time she attacks. So I really like this card. It's kind of a fun thing I think we could build around, especially if you're doing the aristocrat stuff or the vampire decks. If you didn't pick up the precon, I would say go ahead and pick this card up. I think it's gonna be a lot of fun for your deck building pleasure if you're into the Orzhov colors. Now, when I did my precon video for the pirates deck, somebody asked me how I felt the deck should be built because it's kind of a scatterball. The precons kind of always have one deck that's kind of where its themes are kind of scattered. Well, the precon for this cycle was the pirates deck, and I thought that the alternate commander was actually a much more interesting commander to build around because we've had Grixis reanimator commanders before. Sauron the Dark Lord comes to mind in recent times. But instead, let's take a look at Don Andres the Renegade. The secondary commander that came in this thing is so interesting. Now, I've said it, and I've said it in a couple of videos now. This is not a commander to play in a group that doesn't like you playing with their toys. So you might need to have a rule zero conversation to see how well they're going to receive this guy as you play. But that said, if you're able to play this, go ahead, take on the role of an actual pirate and start stealing their stuff. I'm planning on actually doing a tech video on this commander here very soon, so keep an eye out for that one. The Vampire Precon actually just keeps on giving here. Another card that I really like here is Charismatic Conqueror. Now, this is kind of fun because this punishes the opponents who play around with treasure creators, Dockside Extortionist, and those kind of things because they can't use their stuff right away unless they want to hand you a whole board full of vampire tokens. So the idea here is to try to double up this trigger. And so that you're guaranteed those tokens, which comes into the last card that I really like. And it's my favorite card of the entire set. And I've said so in other videos. And that's Roaming Throne. This thing doubles up the triggers, not just ETBs, not just death triggers, all triggers. It doubles them up as long as you're naming a creature type that's associated with that creature type. So, like the Charismatic Conqueror, if you have that in the Vampire deck, you name Vampire, and they can't tap the same token twice that comes into play. So, when they start generating their artifacts, and they go to tap the first time, okay, great. I still get the second trigger because it's going to trigger twice. So this thing is great for anything. And there's so many different types of triggers that are bolstered by this thing. Somebody was questioning why I didn't use Teysa Karlov over this in the deck. And I listed off probably a good dozen cards that actually this thing affected that Teysa has no effect on. So I think that this thing is going to be highly underestimated and until people realize what it actually does. Like we have so many panharmonicon effects that affect ETBs and then Tesa affecting death triggers that people don't realize. I don't think anyways, at least not yet, that this covers all triggering effects instead. So those are my cards that I recommend. If you are looking to get good selection of cards added to your collection, these are the cards I would take a look at, especially the stuff that's real generic, like the Roaming Throne and the Get Lost of the world. And then if you were looking to build new commanders, I would look at maybe some of the commanders that I recommended in this lineup as well. So with that said, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Have a great day, and we'll see you in the next one.